Earlier in our gospel reading, we heard Jesus say, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let it be afraid." Jesus says he gives us peace. We hear Jesus talk many times about peace in the Gospels. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus is a guest at someone's house and they are eating a meal. A woman in town, who we are told was a sinner, comes in. She has heard Jesus is there. She comes in and she brings a jar of fragrant oil. And she kneels down at Jesus' feet. It says that she washes his feet with her tears. She dries his feet with her hair. Then she kisses her feet and puts fragrant oil on them. And there are people in the house who are shocked at this, and they think and say among themselves, if Jesus is the prophet he claims to be, he would have known what kind of person this woman is, and he never would have let her near him. And so Jesus hears them, and he replies that he came into this house, and the host of the house did not offer him water to wash his feet with. That apparently was a custom back then. And this woman came in, though, and washed them with her tears and dried them with her hair. And Jesus said this woman had a lot to be forgiven for, and since she was forgiven, she was very grateful. And then Jesus turns to this woman and he says, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." In the Gospel of Luke, we also find the account of a woman who touches the hem of Jesus' garment and was healed of a hemorrhage. You remember the scene was that crowds were thronging around Jesus, and this woman said she was bankrupt because she'd spent all of her money on doctors and she had not been healed. She couldn't really get up to Jesus to talk to him, but she said, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I know I'll be healed. So somehow she pushed her way through the crowd and she did that. And Jesus felt the healing power go out of him, and he turned to her and he said, "Have courage, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." In John chapter 16, Jesus is talking to his disciples shortly before he is crucified, and he says, "These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace." Both the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John report how Jesus, having risen from the grave, appeared in the midst of his disciples, and when he appeared to them, he said, "Peace be with you." Over and over again in the Gospels, it is said that Jesus gives us peace. And in the New Testament, after the Gospels, we see that same thing. In Ephesians chapter 2, it talks about Jesus, and it says, "He came and preached peace to you who were far off, and peace to those who were near." Romans chapter 17 says, "For the kingdom of God is not eating and drinking, but it is righteousness and peace and joy." Galatians 5:22 lists peace as one of the fruits of the Spirit. The book of Ephesians tells us, "Walk worthy of the calling in which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." There's so much mention of peace in the New Testament. It is seen as something God gives us. But what exactly is peace? You know, peace is hard to define because it has so many different connotations. We might say that a country is at peace when it is not at war with another country, and that is peace, when your country is not involved in a war. But peace has more meanings than that. On a personal level, we might define peace as something like inner calm. Something bad happens, and from all outward appearances, it looks like that you're handling it very well, and you are calm on the inside. In the face of something upsetting, you don't show being upset. We talk about people like that as being at peace with themselves. In the face of something bad happening, We talk about people being at peace with the situation. We talk about people being at peace with things. And so peace in this sense is a state where you don't let things visibly upset you. It is a feeling of acceptance, that you just accept whatever happens. It's almost a feeling of resignation, that you just resign yourself to accepting what happens. It's almost a sense of giving up. And that's a very popular way about thinking of peace in a personal sense. Now let's think about peace in a societal sense. Obviously, we don't have peace in society today. Our society is fractured into all kinds of groups fighting with each other. And you know, that can be mystified because everybody says they want peace. We live in a society where everybody says, I'm for peace, I'm for peace. So if we live in a society where everybody is for peace, why do we not have it? You'd think that because everybody's for it, we'd have it, but we don't. Why not? Well, let's think of it. Let's assume you got two groups, Group A and B. Group A and B disagree and they're both at each other's throats. Group A says, we're perfectly willing to get along with Group B and work with Group B. We're perfectly willing to do that. What they don't add, though, is this. If Group B sees things like we do. And you know, Group B says, we're willing to work with Group A and get along with Group A. But what they don't say is, if they'll just see things the way we do. And that kind of attitude is the reason we do not have peace. I'm for peace. I'm all for peace. And we can have peace if you'll let me have my way. Now let's go further than that. Let's take Group A again. Group A says we're for peace, and the reason we don't have peace is Group B, because they won't come together with us. But what they really mean is, the reason we don't have peace with Group B is because they won't see things like we do. And of course Group B says we're all for peace and we want peace, but Group A won't work with us. What they really mean is that Group A won't see things like we do. You see what a vicious circle that is? I might say, I'm for peace, I'm for getting along, when everything goes my way. That's what we're really saying. This view of peace is best characterized as in the words of, this is a paraphrase of what one world leader in the 20th century said, peace is the end of resistance to what we want. So this is a view of peace centered on what I want, how I think things should be. If things will go my way, there can be peace. Peace is the end of resistance to what I want. So what did Jesus mean when he talked about peace? To try to find out, let's start with the Greek word found in the New Testament manuscripts that's translated as peace. It's the Greek word irene. That's been taken over into English as a woman's name. I remember when I was in junior high school, I had a teacher in the 8th grade named Irene. Now, Irene was a goddess in Greek mythology. And she was associated with having plenty. She was also often depicted in art, shown holding a horn of plenty. You know what? That's a basket that's made in the shape of a horn with a bunch of fruit in it. Back years ago, my grandmother used to have one sitting on the dining room table with that wax fruit in it, you know, the way people used to do that. A horn of plenty. And that was associated with having plenty to eat, plenty of food. And she was also sometimes depicted in art as holding the infant god Plutus. Plutus was the god of wealth. But Irene was not necessarily associated with wealth in the sense of being filthy rich, just wealth in the sense of having plenty and having all you need. And she was sometimes also associated with nursing mothers, because women who have plenty to eat are easily able to nurse their babies. And so Irene was associated with having plenty, especially plenty to eat. And because of that, she was also associated with agriculture. Sometimes she was depicted in art as carrying a bushel of corn up on her head. And so, since she was associated with agriculture, she was also associated with spring. And spring and agriculture sort of go hand in hand, because spring is the most critical time in agriculture. It's when you put your crops in. It's the most critical time in farming. And back when we used to have tobacco on our farm, I could always tell in spring what the crop was going to be like. That's when the die was cast. By the time summer came around, the die was already cast. Now, something can happen in the summer to ruin things, but if your crop doesn't get off to a good start in the spring, there's really nothing going to come along in the summer to make up for that. So spring is the critical time in agriculture, and that's why it makes sense for a goddess associated with agriculture to also be associated with spring. So we have Irene associated with plenty to eat, associated with agriculture, and associated with spring. So how did that get associated with peace? Well, in the ancient world, if you had successful agriculture, that is, if you had good crops and large flocks of animals, you'd have plenty to eat. If you've ever done farming, you know farming is a lot of work. It's a lot of hard work. In the ancient world, it was even more hard work because there was no motorized farm machinery. In order to have good crops, you had to put in a lot of work. Now think for a minute. Assume you are a man in the ancient world and you are a farmer. You're going to have to put a lot of work to your farming in order to be successful. But what if your country is at war and you have to go off and fight? How are you going to be at home to work your field? So what gets grown on your farm if you're off fighting in a war somewhere? Not very much. If a country is at war and most of the able-bodied men are off fighting in the war, there's not going to be a lot of agricultural work done, and there's not going to be a lot of food produced. People might not have enough to eat. And there's another factor involved. In the ancient world, one of the main targets of invading armies was that they would go through and they would destroy the crops. Then the people wouldn't have anything to eat. That happened here in the South in the Civil War. The invading Union armies came into the South and destroyed people's crops. And so times of war became associated with not having enough to eat. When there was no war, that became associated with having plenty of food. After all, soldiers can't farm, and farmers can't be soldiers. Invading armies come in and destroy the crop. And that's how the goddess Irene became associated with peace. People noticed over the years that the times when there was plenty to eat was most likely the times of peace, and the times when there wasn't a lot to eat was most likely the times of war. So this Greek word Irene that is translated in our Bibles as peace is actually fundamentally associated with having enough to eat. You have plenty to eat. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever really been hungry for a long period of time. I would imagine that we have not. None of us have been. You know, you may have been on a diet sometime and been hungry. You may have been going in for surgery and couldn't eat for so many hours before your surgery or something like that. Or you may have gotten delayed on an appointment or a trip or something and missed lunch or something. But I don't think any of us know what it's like to not have had food for months, not have had enough food for months, and have no prospect of having it all. You can imagine that life living like that would not be very good. And so there's a contrast. Try to imagine what it would be like and how you would feel if you hadn't had a good meal in 2 months, if you had just barely been able to scrape by enough food to survive and you had no prospects of having any more. Just think about what your life would be like. Think how different you would feel than the way you feel today. And think about what a different outlook you'd have on life. Think of going to the supper table one night to eat supper, and you've been working all day and you're starving to death, and there's only a handful of food there, only enough like for 2 bites of food, and that's all you had. How would you feel when you got up from that table? Think of the difference in how you'd feel if you got up from the table, though, if you had fried chicken and rice and gravy and biscuits, corn on the cob, and a piece of chocolate pound cake. Think of how different you'd feel. That's the meaning of peace in the Bible right there. That's the meaning of peace in the Bible. It's not a sense of inner calm. It's not the state of your country not being at war with other countries, and it's not even an end to conflict in society. Peace in the Bible is like the feeling you get when you get up from the supper table after having had a really good meal. That's peace in the Bible. And you know, that kind of peace is not connected with whether your country's at war or not. It's not connected with whether there's conflict in society. Remember, Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give to you." So the peace Jesus gives us is not dependent on what happens in the world. It's not dependent on anything going on. Now, in the passage we've looked at today, Jesus flat out says, "My peace I give to you." So why don't we have it? Why don't we have a life where we feel like we just got up from the table from eating a big meal? Well, if you'll notice when Jesus says, "My peace I give to you," he goes on to say, "Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." The verb tense there is in the form of a command, an instruction. The English translators have put that in. They have put the word "let." You see, Jesus says, "Do not let your heart be troubled. Do not let it be afraid." And so what Jesus is telling you is, I am giving you peace. Just don't let yourself cover it up with other things. If you go in the Gospels and read Jesus' parable of the sower, one of the incidents in there is the seed that is sown among thorns or sown among weeds. And the weeds come up and they choke out the plants. And Jesus tells us, "He who received seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, but the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful." You see, Jesus gives us peace, but if we let the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches come in, they will choke it out. We have peace. Jesus has given that to us. But we can spoil it if we let the cares of the world choke that peace out. If we let the cares of the world grow up around us to the point that they strangle us out. And so if we do not live with the feeling of just having gotten up from the supper table after a big meal, maybe it's because we have allowed the cares of the world to choke that out. We have to work and be on guard to preserve the peace that Jesus has given us. In the face of everything that's going on in the world, in spite of everything that's going on in the world, we can have the feeling of getting up from the table after a big meal if we choose to. Jesus has given us that. It's up to us as to whether we will let the cares of the world drown that out.